Chapter 6. Not a big enough name. When I landed in Honolulu, the airline had lost my luggage. I had managed to lose my plane ticket to Atlanta too and had to spend the cash I had to buy a new one. I wasn't about to call my dad and ask him to wire me money. I prided myself on being a son my parents didn't have to worry about. But I did have the phone number of a genuine Samoan prince in my pocket, and I called him from the first pay phone I saw. No answer. Now what? I hung up the phone only to turn and find Prince Soai standing there smiling at me like an answered prayer. Dean had befriended Soai on one of his many mysterious trips to Hawaii, and then Soai had come up to Calgary to break into the business. He was easily big and muscular enough to become a wrestler, but it turned out he was happier being around the business than in it. In a Hawaiian shirt and a brand new cherry red El Camino, Soai reminded me of a happy Neanderthal. As soon as we pulled away from the curb, he handed me a joint. "Light this up, brother. You're safe with me." I didn't want to offend him. When we got to his place, Soai loaned me shorts, flip-flops and a Clark Hatch muscle shirt. Thanks to the Don Hobuffet and training every day, I got up over 200 pounds for the first time ever. At the end of a week by the Blue Pacific, I was relaxed and carefree, skin bronzed and hair wild. On the way to my match, Soai made me promise to have a good one because his entire family and all his friends would be there. He had promised them I was tough, and I sure as hell better be. In the dressing room I met the legendary Samoan High Chief Peter Maivia, who ran the territory with his wife, Leah. Their son-in-law, Rocky Johnson, was one of my favorite wrestlers when I was a kid. Rocky's young son, Dwayne, hung around just outside the dressing room. Dwayne was destined 20 years later to become The Rock, one of the biggest stars in the history of wrestling. Peter wanted a 20-minute draw and felt awkward asking me whether I'd mind working heel, but I thought it was a great opportunity. My partner was Kurt Vonnsteiger, another wrestler I had watched when I was growing up, who was still doing his Nazi gimmick. We were up against Buck Sumhoff and Greg Gagne, son of Vern Gagne. Greg was a decent worker, although, just as they did with me, people said that he got ahead because he was a promoter's son. I set a blistering pace, doing most of the work, much to the relief of Vonnsteiger. In front of a loud and easy crowd, I discovered how much fun it is to play the part of a hot-headed jerk, and I made the babyfaces work even harder to keep up with me. Back in the dressing room, between gasps for breath, Greg told me I needed to slow down. I went off to shower, smiling. As I was lathering up, I was startled by Ripper Collins, a squat, pig-faced wrestler with slicked back white hair. I hoped he was just admiring my tan, but he asked me straight out if I was gay. He shuffled off after I bluntly told him I wasn't. I remembered a sordid incident when he worked Stu's territory a few years back. Halfway through a show in Fort McMurray, he left the building to get gas for Stu's van and picked up a teenaged hitchhiker whom Ripper allegedly sexually molested. The boy managed to fight him off and get away. As Stu described it, Ripper damn near bit the poor kid's prick off. Ripper was arrested but somehow managed to persuade his naive landlady to bail him out, explaining that it was all a dreadful mistake. She used her house to post his bail bond, but he skipped over the border and was gone by morning. The poor lady lost her house. Ripper died of AIDS in 1991. Judging by the grin on Soai's face when I came out of the dressing room after the match, he was pleased with how I'd done. I left Hawaii the next day. I often wonder what became of Soai. I have never seen him again. Mahalo, brudda. I walked into the dressing room in Atlanta on October 5th, ready to make my mark. Abdullah the Butcher turned in his chair and shot me a look. "I remember you." As I shook his heavily jeweled hand, I asked, "Remember the t-shirt I silk screened for you in art class? Stu let me give it to you as a present, out behind the dressing rooms back in Calgary." "That was you?" What I didn't tell him was that when I was 12 years old I was so terrified of him that I couldn't look him in the eye. Abdullah was heavier and older now, but back in 1970 he had moved like a 300-pound cat, flying through the air to deliver an elbow drop that looked like it would kill you. Not long after I'd given Abdullah the t-shirt, I'd sat with my friend Wilk next to the Timekeeper watching this giant monster sink his teeth into my dad's bloody head. I'd kicked him as hard as I could, leaving the imprint of my running shoe on the seat of his white karate pants. He had turned his bald, scarred head, rolled his eyes right at me and had let me live. Wilk just stared at me, horrified. While I was still talking with Abby, a wrestler known as Superstar Billy Graham came over to me. Wayne Coleman was 6'3", with 24-inch biceps. I remembered him in the dungeon on the mat, where Stu had him clamped in a thread through with his arms twisted up behind his head, as he was screaming for his life. "Please say hello to your dad," he said. "I'll never forget how much he did for me." Just then, Ole Anderson, the Atlanta booker, introduced himself and said he needed me for a 20-minute draw with a French-Canadian wrestler, René Goulet. Goulet was working a French Foreign Legionnaire heel gimmick and stood sour-faced with his arms crossed as Oli explained that he needed to see what kind of worker I was. I told myself that I'd get all my moves in, whether René liked it or not. He didn't appreciate the liberties I took bumping him all over the ring, but when the bell rang, I knew I'd had a good match. As I sat undoing my bootlaces, I heard Oli's voice on the other side of the dressing room wall. Did anyone see Hart's match? Damn, I really wanted to see him work. The fall weather in Happaville, a seedy suburb of Atlanta, was beautiful, but I spent most of the time I wasn't working in a basic, furnished room at the notorious Falcons Rest Apartments, watching TV. I remember watching every moment of the coverage of the United States Embassy hostage-taking in Tehran by followers of the Ayatollah Khomeini. I was making less money than I had been at home, even though the houses we played to were full, but all the wrestlers seemed to be in the same boat, most of us staying at the Falcons Rest, sharing rides to the venues when we could. I was depending on Buzz Sawyer, no relation to Terry, a short, thick, bald kid, my age, with similar ambition, to get me to the shows. At first he'd been helpful, assuming that since I was a promoter's kid I had some clout, but when it became obvious how untrue that was, I'd had to keep my door propped open to catch him as he jogged by my door to the parking lot. He'd intentionally leave me behind just to make me look bad. The last time he left me stranded I missed my first town ever. Oli was mad, but not madder than I was. Suddenly, one day Buzz flashed by my doorway yelling, "Come on," and tore off down the hall. I grabbed my bag and ran as fast as I could, but all I found was an empty parking lot, again. I headed over to the phone booth, digging through my pockets for the phone number of Candy, a huge cheerleader who seemed nothing but innocent to me but turned out to be one of a horde of ring rats who hung around the Falcons Rest and came to my room like it was a revolving door, eager to please. I asked her for a ride, and she was only too happy to help me out. When she got there, she insisted that I drive, and at the edge of town, she slid my zipper down and lowered her head. I was 21 and single, and I was no more innocent than she was. I tried to keep my eyes on the road. The next day I was in that phone booth again calling around for a ride. I wasn't supposed to ride with the heels, and none of my fellow babyfaces ever seemed to have room for me. Just as I'd run out of people to call, a Lincoln Town car pulled up behind me. Ernie Ladd with his big red afro was hunched over the steering wheel. "You stuck again, kid? Come on, jump in." I've always thought it was strange that the heels were usually nicer people than the supposed good guys. Ernie was a 6'9" pale-skinned black man, one of the greatest defensive tackles to ever play in the NFL. Up front next to Ernie was Bobby the Brain Heenan, a fast-talking, crazy-bumping manager with a shock of bleached white hair. I climbed in back with the Russian bear Ivan Koloff, famous for being one of the few guys to beat Bruno Sammartino for the WWF World title. Ivan said hello in a heavy Russian accent. "I remember you," I said. "You're Red McNulty from Winnipeg. I watched you have your first match, with Firpo Zybysko, up in Calgary." He was stunned. Later he pulled me aside and politely asked me to never tell anyone about that. Everyone believes I'm Russian. In those days a wrestler became his gimmick. He lived it. A few blocks from the building, Ernie slowed down to let me out so I wouldn't be seen with the heels, and as I walked along the street the babyfaces drove past me in their empty cars. Inside I was surprised to see Andre the Giant, playing cards with his usual 2 big bottles of red wine on the table beside him. I extended my hand and said, "Hey, boss." He ignored me like I was invisible. "Thanks, Smith." That night I was working with Ernie, who said, "Okay, kid, we'll seesaw to the waltz across Texas, and then you slip on a banana peel, 1, 2, 3, you got it?" What a simple analogy for a wrestling match. Ernie Ladd did all right by me. When Harley Race came to Atlanta to defend the NWA World Heavyweight title, he took me under his wing, insisting I ride with him. He always bought me a few beers for the drive, and he never let me pay for meals. Buzz couldn't believe his eyes when he saw me riding with the world champion, and after that I was treated well by everyone. Though, as far as I was concerned, it was too late. I wanted to go home. I wasn't earning enough, wasn't being pushed by Ole and Barnett. When I called Stu, he told me he could use me anytime. He also had news. Big Jim, who had been injured in the preseason, and had yet to set foot on the field for the Raiders, had flown Ellie down to visit him in Reno, Nevada, and he proposed. When she said yes, he bartered his Raider helmet for a bottle of Dom Perignon. They were set to tie the knot at Hart House on December 26th unless the Raiders made the playoffs. As soon as I hung up the phone I called Jim Barnett, who agreed to let me go, a little too quickly, I thought. We decided I'd finish up in early December. Then Ole's budding star, Buzz, held up the office for more money, and when Ole said no, he walked out on him. Afterwards, Well, he told me what I already knew. We had to decide on your first night whether to push you or Buzz, and damned if I didn't miss your entire match. So I went with Buzz, and now look. That night in the dressing room, Bobby Jaggers, a harmless but outrageous bullshitter and heel, cornered a large rat in the dressing room and happily stomped it to death. Which, trust me, was harder than one might think. The masked superstar, Bill Eadie, went off on him. I suppose you're just going to go in the ring now with dead rat germs all over your boots, you moron. I'd never seen a rat before, and I don't think I was the only one, judging by the way so many big, tough wrestlers jumped up on chairs. After the rat stomping, Lee introduced me to Sterling Golden, the territory's newest big blonde heel. He had quite a presence about him, standing a massively muscled 6'9" and sporting the biggest arms I'd ever seen. As soon as I saw him, I thought, boy, my dad would love to get his hands on this guy. Ole told me to make it short and simple because Golden was green. I hit the ropes, and when I crashed into him it felt like I'd hit a brick wall. I charged again, right into his waiting arms. He squeezed me like an anaconda while I screamed uncle and writhed in agony. After almost being disqualified for not releasing me, he dropped me limp to the mat, dead, like Bobby Jaggers's rat. His real name was Terry Bollea, soon to become Hulk Hogan. When I was on my way home to Calgary, Hito tracked me down in Chicago, where I'd stopped to visit a friend. He called with big news. Dynamite had been scheduled to wrestle Fujinami for the WWF Junior Heavyweight Championship at Madison Square Garden the next day, but his papers weren't in order. The New Japan office would be grateful if I could take his place. My mind raced. Here was my big break, a chance to wrestle at Madison Square Garden, on a card that would be broadcast across the eastern United States and throughout Japan. I'd never been to New York before. As the yellow taxi made its way through the crowded, noisy streets, it looked pretty much like I had expected it would from TV. I got out of the cab in front of the Statler Hilton Hotel across the street from Madison Square Garden, to find Hito waiting for me. We were immediately surrounded by a mob of Japanese reporters. Hito pulled me close and advised me to be intimidating. Being a heel was the best way to get over with the Japanese press. Any fears I'd had vanished, and I was the picture of confidence as I waded into them. I did one interview after another, posing for photos with a fixed glare on my face and my fists balled up in anger. When Hito suggested that I go up to my hotel room and rest before the match, I was too pumped up to lie down, thinking about different strategies and moves for my debut in the greatest wrestling hall in the world. When it was time, I came out of the elevator and strode across the lobby riding high and ran straight into Hito. From the look on his face, I could tell something was wrong. You off? No work, Fujinami. Vince McMahon say you know big name to work Madison Square Garden. Me sorry. And he handed me an envelope with $500 in it from New Japan. I was crushed, and Hito felt almost as badly as I did. He invited me to the dressing room, but I didn't want to hang around like a pathetic wannabe. Instead, I went back up to my room, ate some Chinese takeout and flew home in the morning. Later I found out it wasn't Vince McMahon Sr. who'd given me the thumbs down, it was his son. Not a big enough name to wrestle at MSG. I made a promise to myself that someday I'd go back there and change Vince Jr.'s mind for him.